But it is, we're right up on time to move into our next session, which, Bill, if you'll just stay on stage. Next is our federal funding panel. And I think in the wording there, it says something about demystifying. Well, you know, a lot of the federal funding can be very mystical sometimes, I think. But for our panel, we'll have a, we'll call a hybrid panel, I guess. Mr. Bill Johnson from AppGeo, Frank Winters, New York State GIO, and then joining us virtually, Sue Buto from USGS, AJ Gupta, HSR Health founder and CEO, and Mike Bergen, Vice President of Public Sector and SafeGraph. And so do we have everybody online?
Yes, I'm here. Thank you. This is AJ.
All right.
Sue's here.
And Mike, I think that.
I'm here. How's it going, everyone?
All right. I think we've got everybody. So I'm going to get out of y'all's way.
Thanks, Jonathan. All right. So while the slides are coming up, let's talk for just a minute about how this fits into an innovation summit. And really happy to have the panel. We're really calling it a learning session because we really have to learn from each other. But innovation doesn't mean necessarily novel, right? We could just be doing something different in our space. We could be looking for an innovative way to resource the things that we know we already want to do, right? So we're not necessarily talking about innovative technology, but maybe innovative approaches. I was thinking back to the broadband grant, Bill, and you know, the work we did, that was big. It was big enough to get our attention, but it was small enough to get our arms around, right? And I think we need, collectively, we need to like hold arms to get around this tree, right? That's a whole nother order of magnitude. So that's kind of what I'm feeling with the Innovation Summit. So I'll just have a couple of quick remarks with a little bit of research that I was able to pull together, and admittedly, no expert. And I'm hungry for this panel to learn as much as to share the little bit that I have learned. So collectively, let's all keep this conversation going. So go ahead and go to the next slide. Oh, actually, yeah, the big green one. Nice. Look at that. Maybe. All right, go ahead to the next slide. So we are talking about collectively demystifying, right? And there's lots of language. There's a few considerations that some of the investments that are made available by the federal funding right now are clearly geospatial. Many, many, many of them are not. There might be, and there likely is, appropriate geospatial investments wrapped up in infrastructure investments, wrapped up in climate investments, wrapped up in other things that the people applying for these grants might not even recognize as geospatial. Time and time again, we see teams coming in to answer someone's RFP, and they bring their GIS team in, and the people that are issuing the RFP say, "Oh, hey, we better get Frank," right? So those are the things that we want to get ahead of, right? We may have some of these funding opportunities that have a long spin-up period, and once they're released, there's a short performance period. So we better get our ducks in a row and get organized ahead of time. So those are some of the things that I'm interested in making sure don't surprise us. So go ahead. Just to collect all this in one spot, I took Mickey Schmidt's slide from his Coastal Caucus talk and copied it here. And these are some specific investments about coastal resilience and coastal issues that we can apply for. Oh, fantastic. Total confidence in you. All right. So one of the things that was kind of interesting is that about this time last year, we were talking about the Lift America Act. And the Lift America Act had some language in it that was fatally flawed because it was referencing very specific standards, which did not account for the GIS standards. So the expenditures, the applicants would have wrongfully assumed that those investments were really only about the sides of the technology that were not geospatial. So we were pretty excited about getting that as an industry changed, and then awfully disappointed to find out that Lift America Act 911 funding was shrunken and then was removed. So I had a nice conversation with Kate Elkins, and she's the acting National 911 Office lead. And she was, we were kind of crying in her beer a little bit about that together, but it was a learning. At least I'm not chasing that down. So Kate says hi, but actually the existing grants that are already underway are the only ones that she was ready to contribute here. So she said, let others talk about the new opportunities. So one of the things that I'm really interested in is those funding opportunities that align with the NSGIC advocacy items. We already have some blueprint. We know what we collectively want to look for. One of those things is getting data in the hands of wayfinding companies. And there's two ways that that happens in general. The existence of an address rolling through the National Address Database, but everything that happens on our roadway that impacts safety that the government needs others to know about, those are really emerging as part of the Work Zone Data Exchange Standard, WZDX. And that will be extended to go beyond work zones and into bridge clearance and other activities on the roadway. So here are some examples of federal grant opportunities as part of the American Recovery and Reinvestment Act that specifically call out WZDX as an eligible expenditure. So we've got the raise opportunity, and there's $1.5 billion and qualifying activity there being WZDX build out. We also have the infrastructure for rebuilding America, the INFRA, infra, and there's in a couple of waves there that also calls out WZDX, and the ITD. So it's already kind of mystified. And how would you choose which one to plug into? We really have to dig into performance periods. What's the time frame? What's your schedule? But WZDX is part of each of those, right? So just wanted to share that as some of the findings that I had in preparing for this. Oh, here I am pointing at you, and I could be doing that. Great. So with that, we'll fire right over to Bill. I'll hold the Tinker Toys.
Okay, thank you, Frank. So there is lots of good news to share on broadband because there's lots of money flowing now, which we'll get into it. I'm only going to give you a very high level view of this. I think the goal of this panel is for our panelists to get through their content quickly, so we have plenty of time for questions and dialogue. And I imagine we're going to get some questions about some of this broadband funding, but let me give you the high level view. So there's two big categories of money that are flowing out onto the landscape to close the broadband gap in this country. The first is the American Relief Program Act, lovingly called ARPA. And that's money that was approved last spring by Congress, and Treasury released it to the states on June 1st. A lot of it is to backfill state coffers on expenses they incurred around dealing with the pandemic. But there's a category of eligibility in there for infrastructure projects. And there are three types of infrastructure projects that are eligible: water, wastewater, and broadband. And Treasury has released guidance on how that works. I got another slide that'll go a little bit deeper into that. The infrastructure bill, which is more correctly called now the Infrastructure Act, it's no longer a bill. It was signed into law on November 15th. And the Infrastructure Act includes $65 billion for broadband, and I'll be getting into that on another slide as well. But bear in mind, those two pots of money, ARPA and the Infrastructure Act, are on top of money, and they don't replace, they are in addition to the other money that's already been out there around broadband. The biggest pots of money at the federal level have been the FCC Universal Service Program, and that's what I was doing for 2 years in DC at USAC. USAC is the delivery arm of the Universal Service Program for the FCC, and that's about $5 billion a year. And then there's USDA has their Rural Utility Service Program, which is a combination of grants and low interest loans for rural broadband projects. So those are still out there. And a lot of states are trying to be more competitive and move ahead of the pack, as it were, with broadband and are spending state money in a variety of ways to move the needle on broadband. So there's a lot of money now flowing around broadband. Now, what's really interesting to me is that for the first time that I can recall over my career, all of the key decisions related to this broadband money are being made using GIS data. Holy smokes. Think about that. I mean, so the Infrastructure Act, that 65 billion, I'm going to get into the details here, but there's both decisions on the funding. One is this formula for how much money each state is going to get. And the numerator in that fraction is the number of unserved and underserved addresses in your state. And the denominator is the total number of unserved and underserved addresses in the US. And that fraction is going to be finalized based on the new FCC broadband map once it appears. So there's GIS data driving the state funding formula. And then once you have your allocation, the eligibility to determine whether a project can use the fund is based on that GIS data to affirm that at least 80% of the addresses in the proposed project area meet the eligibility criteria. So holy smokes. And then ARPA, which is the money that's already out there, the Infrastructure Act money isn't flowing yet. I'll be describing that more in a minute, but the ARPA money is on the street now and states are already starting to use that, and there's Treasury guidance on how they can use it. The Treasury guidance does not specify whose map you need to use. You can use a state map, you can use the existing federal FCC Form 477 data, but you have to demonstrate that the proposed project areas are unserved at a 25.3 threshold. So again, it's GIS data. That's pretty interesting. Now, let's break down what's going on with ARPA first, and then we'll go into the Infrastructure Act funds. So ARPA, this is short-term money. This money has to be obligated by December 31st, 2024. So it's not money that you can use for anything that's going to extend beyond that, which means, in all practical purposes, what states are using this for are the so-called shovel-ready broadband projects. And the Treasury guidance on this is that the projects are supposed to be at service of 100 megabits per second symmetrical, 100 down, 100 up, which in practical terms means fiber. There is allowance under the Treasury guidance to do something less than that if it's upgradable to 100 meg symmetrical later on. So people are interpreting that a variety of ways, but it's that's how it works. Now, one thing to know about ARPA is the state's got this tranche of cash and they don't have specific pots to allocate it in. It's not like only a certain percentage of that ARPA money can be spent on broadband. States have the discretion to decide how to divvy up their ARPA funds under all of the eligible criteria. Again, broadband being one of those. So states have a lot of latitude. They could be putting a lot of their ARPA money onto broadband, and some of them are being quite aggressive about that. Some are doing very little with ARPA, but it's a state decision. So you might want to be talking to your state broadband office about what's going on if you aren't already in dialogue with them. Because as I've said, GIS is really a critical piece of this puzzle. Now, the Infrastructure Act fund is a lot more complicated, and I'm really skimming over a lot of the details here. The text of the bill is a 1,069 page PDF, which I downloaded, and I've read the 85 pages that relate to the Broadband Act, and it's not easy reading. I don't recommend it to you. But I have a pretty good feel how it works now. So this of the 65 billion, a big chunk of it refills the coffers on an existing FCC program for affordability subsidies for low-income people to get a cheaper broadband plan. So that's a carve off the top. What's left is mostly this $42.45 billion Broadband Equity Access and Deployment Program, BEAD. So learn that acronym. If you haven't learned it already, the BEAD program is going to matter to you going forward. It's going to be administered by NTIA, part of the Commerce Department. And the BEAD program is essentially a block grant to the states. And the way it works is the states are going to get a small amount of the funds. I mean, we're talking a lot of money here. So 5% of your state's allocation on 42 billion is still serious money that can be used in the planning stage to develop what's called an initial proposal. And that is what you go back to NTIA with to request funds. And NTIA is going to look at your plan, and it's going to be some iterations back and forth for them to make sure that your plan complies with all of the program guidance, which is not on the street yet. That program guidance is be due on the street if they meet their the deadline that's in the law, and there's no guarantee that'll happen, would be May 15th. There's a 180-day clock from when the Infrastructure Act was signed to when what's called the NOFO, the Notice of Funding Opportunity. And that's where all the program rules would be available. And that's supposed to be May 15th. We'll see if they make it. So I can't tell you all the things that you're going to have to put into your plan. That'll be in the NOFO. And then you would get a certain percentage of the money based on approval of the initial plan. And then you have to submit the final plan to get all of the money. So NTIA is in the driver's seat on making sure that you're going to spend the money under the rules. But then the state, it's entirely at the state's discretion to then make what they call sub-grant awards. So you're going to, as a state program, you are going to be awarding that funding out to whatever partners you deem to be the ones that you want to accomplish your state's broadband goals. Okay. And it's it's interesting that the Treasury for ARPA set the standard as 100 meg symmetrical as the target. And what the Infrastructure Act has is 120. So there's a difference there. Okay. And then there's an additional program, 2.75 billion for digital equity that works the same way. Now, the digital equity money is all about who's getting left out and why are they getting left out? Is it income issues? Is it access to the tools? Is it digital literacy and knowing how to do things online? And so programs targeted to making sure that not only have we wired up the country, but we've equipped people with what they need to actually use it in terms of skills. So that's what the digital equity program is for. And that works similarly. It's a block grant to the states. They submit an initial plan and a final plan. The money is released and they implement the programs. Okay, so why should I care? First of all, the eligibility is going to be based on that new FCC map. That map is going to be based on an entirely new reporting process that the carriers are going to be using for the first time, where they're going to be reporting footprints of areas or addresses where they can offer service, although those addresses won't be released. And the FCC is going to then combine that with a brand new data set that they are in the process of buying a license for from the commercial sector on broadband serviceable locations. So we got new reporting requirements, new processes, a new layer that's being required to do that overlay on, which almost guarantees in my mind that it's going to be less than 100% correct. And remember, that's the data, that's the map that's going to determine how much money your state gets. So right out of the gate, you should have an immediate interest in making sure that map is right. Because that's the numerator in the fraction of how much your state gets, right? So there's a challenge process. The way that new FCC map is going to be constructed is per the language in the Broadband Data Act of 2 years ago, which lays out how this is all going to work. And there's a challenge process. So when the map comes out, anyone can challenge the data that was reported by the carriers, the data that's in the broadband fabric, the process is used, anything that impacts the accuracy that you can challenge. You can supply data to the FCC, say, here's the data I have in my state that shows that you missed, 108,000 locations, which would improve my funding formula. I'm just throwing numbers out here, but that's the point of doing a challenge, is to make sure that that map is right. So you want to be thinking now about how to do that. And everything in the new program, if you were aware of how broadband worked up to now, all of the eligibility stuff was tied to census geography, which we all know had lots of problems, hid a lot of errors, masked a lot of served and unserved variability in the data. Everything in the new program is address or location based. So we're suddenly moving to point granularity, which is a great thing. And by the way, you're already working on point addressing because you need it for NextGen 911. You need it for your state geocode. You need it for 1,033 things. So this is all great. We got some synergies all coming together around important data. And now this data has another important use worth billions of dollars to you. Isn't that awesome? So yeah, I'll stop there. Thank you.
Thanks, Bill. Really appreciate that. And we'll jump right in and let AJ share his his thoughts on public health. And just as a matter of background, AJ and his company has plugged into the National Pandemic GIS Task Force, and that's how we met. And really happy to have you as part of our group here, and hopefully you'll get that NSGIC bug and keep coming back too.
Absolutely. Thank you, Frank. I'm honored to have the opportunity to join this panel today and speak with all of you about federal funding opportunities. I definitely think that if we are able to demystify federal funding, it's likely going to be the greatest innovation in mankind's history. Because given the enormous scope of federal government, as Frank mentioned, I'm sure everyone here knows something about funding streams or opportunities and can contribute to a session like this. I'm sure that we will all learn a little bit from each other. But just a bit about me, as Frank said, my name is Ajay Gupta. I run a health tech firm. We leverage geospatial technology, data science and AI models, and social determinants of health data to perform really risk analytics surrounding the tracking of the spread of infectious disease and assessing the resources required to treat and address those diseases. In addition, I chair the Open Geospatial Consortium's Health Domain Working Group and serve on the board of my alma mater, the University of Maryland College Park. And I mention those two things as they'll come up in the talk today. For today, I'll focus on funding opportunities that involve geospatial tech in the healthcare space. The healthcare industry is traditionally a late adopter to new technology. And as such, both users and funders are not always certain what the technology can bring to the practice of medicine. And so education campaigns to convey and demonstrate the solutions that are achievable in the real world and the benefits to healthcare and to ultimately patients are needed and can help direct usage for and funding of worthwhile technology initiatives. OGC pilot opportunities like the recent 2021 disasters pilot are a good source of such educational efforts. Next slide, please. One thing I have noticed, and I'm certainly happy to hear and discuss alternate views, is that there is an appetite for innovative solutions to advance the state of healthcare, especially for leveraging geospatial solutions. The previous speaker, Bill, mentioned that GIS is now being leveraged to make decisions in broadband. We're not quite there yet in healthcare, but that is the direction we're going, such as things like using GIS to make a decision on where to place field hospitals in a pandemic, or how to direct supplies from warehouses to clinics. So for our purposes here, we can consider funding opportunities in very broad categories, starting with grants, which are really designed to fund research and development, but can also fund pilots of new technologies and their capabilities. Operational funding, which in this context could leverage GIS and location data as they become more and more important in determining what the healthcare needs and delivery strategies can be. So operational funding initiatives can help with actual implementation efforts. And earmarks. If we talk about federal funding, we have to acknowledge the political process that an earmark is and carefully consider that. They involve often the omnibus spending bills, but the process for earmarks can be different for every legislator. Next slide, please. The place to start in looking for federal funds is grants.gov, which lists the majority of US government funding opportunities, though not all. It does have a search capability, and the output here is based on a keyword search of GIS and for opportunities where city and county governments are eligible. The links feature here to search grants.gov is something I do recommend everybody spend time looking through. Not necessarily just for seeking money, but at least to start the process of understanding what is being funded now and into the future. Next slide, please. The government does see commercialization with a lot of the funding that they make. There are funding opportunities that are designed directly to help achieve commercialization, starting with one program that I'm sure most have known about, if not taken part of, the Small Business Innovation Research and Small Business Technology Transfer Programs, also just simply known as the SBIR program, which seeks commercialization through technological innovation. All agencies with research budgets have SBIR programs, including the National Institutes of Health, the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention, and the Food and Drug Administration. And there are 3 phases to the SBIR program, with phase 1 typically between 50 and 250,000 for a 6-month effort. But some agencies have waivers allowing for higher funding amounts, and I've seen amounts as high as 385,000. And phase 2 funding typically at 750,000, again with waivers that go up to a few million. And phase 3, which does not provide funding, but provides something even better, a sole source contracting opportunity with the US government and closely allied foreign governments. So while this is a commercialization opportunity and is geared for for-profit companies, they can be used to develop the technology or implement the technology to meet a local jurisdiction's needs. It can be positioned as an opportunity to fine-tune, test, or validate a solution. And essentially, in this case, jurisdictions can partner with businesses to seek SBIR funding for their planned engagements. Next slide, please. Innovation is today's buzzword, certainly appropriate for this conference. And there are a lot of funding that calls for innovation. And the projects funded under this banner can also be efforts that take place in and are responsive to challenges faced by our local communities. This is by no means an exhaustive list, but on this slide, the CDC displays, and these are all taken from the links that are shown on the slide. They show the desired topics areas as well as past funded projects for the CDC on this slide. Next slide. The Department of Health and Human Services. And lately, a lot of the funding has gone towards COVID-19 related efforts, of course, appropriately. We all anticipate that eventually that'll come back to other areas as well. And next slide. The National Science Foundation also uses innovation and seed funds to essentially get projects started. Next slide. Also, with respect to infrastructure, and in an area where infrastructure can overlap with healthcare needs, are smart cities. And the National Science Foundation is just one agency that is putting resources into smart cities through its Smart and Connected Communities program. There's also here a search feature to see current and past projects. This program involves a university component. Again, the idea is that funds go to a university that is developing a solution that can and should meet a stated local need. And the highlighted projects here, and I realize that it's hard to read on the slide, but you can again search the link, involve geospatial technologies. Next slide, please. Of course, someone in my position running a health firm is always advocating for greater funding for GIS initiatives in health and medical industries, but there is actually activity in this regard shown here for a specific project undertaken by the National Cancer Institute in conjunction with the University of California, San Diego. Because the nature of health projects are that they are research-oriented, clinical trial-oriented, often you see that the first phase of funding goes to a research organization, an academic institution, a nonprofit, and then goes into a commercial setting. So these kinds of partnerships are a good way to move from ideation of new technologies into practice. Next slide, please. I know this is a US audience, but just for completeness, I mentioned that funding does extend to global efforts, such as through the USAID, which funds efforts in foreign countries that involve US businesses. They also have a search tool and do show both past, current, and future planned initiatives in the regions of the world and those that are managed here through the USAID's Washington office. Next slide, please. So in summary, you do have to stay persistent in efforts to secure funding. This is because there are, as was previously mentioned, potentially a long funding and appropriation cycle and gaps between when funding is approved and actually distributed by Treasury. So this effort will need patience. The process also involves multi-level politics, really at every level of government. And this isn't to say that there is a right or wrong party or that you can be left out due to your political leanings, but rather to say this influences how you communicate the projects you're trying to accomplish and how you define their value. And while not required, a business case to secure federal funding is aided by partnerships, public-private partnerships, as a term was mentioned, but partnerships across for-profit businesses, nonprofit research organizations like academic organizations or industry organizations like the OGC, and government partners make a good case that can be used to advocate and secure funding. And even in the earmark process, which is a political process, these kinds of partnerships make it easier for the legislator to push an earmark through the political process. Thank you. I'll turn it back over to Frank.
Great. Thanks very much, AJ. And we'll jump right into Mike Bergen.
Hey, thanks everyone. This is always good, I think, where you tell people, you tell them again, and you tell them again. So we actually talked about the Treasury funds for state and local government, focus more around the broadband piece, but I wanted to kind of share some wins and some at least positive momentum that I'm seeing using it for other things. Mentioned the broadband infrastructure, that $350 billion for state, local, and tribal governments, but there's been some updates recently, as well as I think some ways that commercial companies like Safegraph have used it to help customers get funds for the data that we provide. So you could use this data essentially to buy data that will help you then, whether it's identify hydrology issues or clean water or any type of movement in and out of the city from a COVID recovery. So we see this as a way to basically bring in additional GIS data outside of COVID because they've expanded it so much. So there was an update on, I think, the January 6th, where they talked about a final rule, and they basically expanded what else you could use the data for. So you could use it for public health and economic impacts. So it's written so broadly where that includes everything from economic response to housing, to healthy food, to curb the side effects of COVID, as well as premium pay. So if you're a state and local government and you're paying essential workers overtime, whether it's emergency response, police, firemen, any type of hospital workers, you can use it for that, as well as revenue loss. So I think this is a story that we should be telling the entire community in the state and local government, that we can use this for revenue loss. And again, we mentioned water, sewer, and broadband infrastructure. The majority of this is actually coming in. There's an additional tranche that's coming in May. So what I'm saying is this is a really good time between now and May to start requesting these types of funds and using companies like Safegraph or some of the other partners that are here at this conference to help set the stage and set the narrative. Because if you go online, there's a pretty easy portal for state and local governments to request funds, but they always need some type of reason or some type of rationale. And how I mentioned before, how we've helped was effectively writing some of the language on those needs of how we'd use the data. So a lot of people here have used Safegraph's data from a COVID recovery standpoint, whether it's the points of interest or the patterns data. So writing that to help and to see how people will help with the hydrology, with some of the public health and economic impacts, but then also the broadband piece. So what I'm saying is you could use a public-private partnership, use companies like Safegraph, what we've identified of writing some of those requests. We've had some real success with some of the local governments. So some cities have actually reached out to us. They needed our data from a COVID response standpoint, understanding when people went back to work. Are people going into the city from a hydrology standpoint so they can understand planning for infrastructure in the next 2, 3, and 4 years? So we've helped them craft effectively their RFP to get access to the Treasury funds with success. So that's something that I wanted to at least talk through. Is I know we talked about broadband, but it's been expanded so much in the last couple of weeks based off of the January ruling that you can effectively use it for anything. We've had customers come to us and start moving outside of COVID, but could you use it for a disaster response from a gray sky event? So as you're recovering from COVID, you had this syndemic combination of hurricanes coming in, and it's cities affected by COVID, but it's also affected by natural disasters. We've actually been able to build the narrative where you can combine the two because cities are still recovering from COVID. So we can get pretty creative to get access to these funds, because one of the biggest issues that I'm sure that you've seen is these funds go away. right? If these funds are not allocated, they actually go away. So there's a timeline on these funds. So it's a ticking clock. So we've been helping customers as much as possible get access to these funds because we realize that by 2024, these funds go away. So I wanted to make sure that this whole group understood that there's commercial companies helping state and local governments craft that response to leverage the treasury funds for the state and local governments. So then we can go after things like the broadband infrastructure, the clean water, and any type of COVID recovery, even from a payment perspective. So I will stop there because because this is, again, we're repeating this, but there's so many funds there and I've seen so much progress and so much success over the last couple of months that I wanted to make sure it wasn't just about broadband. That's about effectively everything else that has been affecting state and local governments during COVID.
That's great. Thanks very much, Mike. And we'll go right on to Subuto, and really happy to have you shed some light and demystify some of the 3DEP and 3D-HP.
And thank you. And in the spirit of Mike, who said, when you tell people and you tell them again and again, we've been collaborating with NSGIC for some time on the 3DEP broad agency announcement, and our goal in 3DEP to complete nationwide acquisition of LiDAR IFSAR in Alaska. So we have the first ever national baseline of consistent publicly available high resolution elevation data for the United States. And I think many of you are very familiar with that goal. Some of you are familiar with our funding mechanisms, but in order to demystify and make sure folks hear it, we'll run through this again. We do issue annually a broad agency announcement, or a BAA, for 3DEP. Again, it's annually. We usually release this call for proposals in late summer. The timing is a little to be determined. We have our paperwork pushed up through Department of Interior for approval. So sometimes it can be delayed or it can be early. So you just have to watch for it in late summer. The BAA is our vehicle that allows the USGS and other federal agencies to partner with our local, state, tribal, and private organizations for the collection of QL2 or better quality LiDAR. And that's based on the USGS LiDAR base specification. You can see the links to both the BAA and the LiDAR specification at the bottom of this slide. And we're very pleased to say that through the broad agency announcement process and through partnerships with our federal partners, we are currently at 84% of the nation covered with LiDAR, or again, IFSAR in Alaska as of the end of 2021. And we're in the process of our FY22 planning. And as I mentioned earlier, we do have a pretty deep collaboration with NSGIC on the 3DEP for the Nation project. And there's a lot of planning documents and information available to NSGIC members through the information hub that Linda Wayne and Phil Worrell have put together for us. So I invite you to look at those resources as well. And I also want to say, before we switch slides, and I'm very pleased to announce that Brian Hadley is the new elevation data acquisition lead for 3DEP. I've been acting in the role for quite some time now, and I will be moving into the lead role as the hydrography data acquisition lead. Brian was just in transition. We were planning this session, so he wasn't able to participate, but hopefully everybody will get to meet him very soon. I think he's going to be a really great data acquisition lead. Next slide. So in terms of the 3DEP BAA, as I mentioned earlier, the timeline is to be determined. We usually do release it in late summer. And we also hold a public webinar, usually in August, to provide information about the application process. Last year's webinar is posted on our webpage. You can look at that webinar for resources to get a feel for how the application process works. It's pretty consistent year on year. So there are probably not a lot of changes in the coming years compared to what you'll see in that public webinar video. The 3DEP broad agency announcement does allow for proposals to collect data either through the USGS Geospatial Products and Services Contract, which we shorthand as GIPSY, or you can apply for a financial assistance award where you as the applicant manage the data acquisition contract and deliver 3DEP compliant data to USGS, which is then validated through our processes to make sure that the data do meet the specification. And we publish criteria for selecting proposals. And those criteria are outlined in the annual program announcement, which I encourage all of you to read. It's not exciting reading, but it's necessary reading to look through that program announcement and understand the funding opportunity and the criteria that are used to select projects. The criteria are used to select projects on a fair and equitable basis. And so all project proposals are pushed through a scoring system and are selected by a committee of selectees. So the 3DEP data acquisition lead is not the sole entity that chooses projects. It's a committee. Those criteria are probably pretty consistent. They have been for some years, and they're listed on this slide. I think the most important are the project location, meaning we select or prefer projects where there are no existing 3DEP data, or where the 3DEP or the LiDAR data is 8 years old or older, or where there's significant landscape change that is defined and described in the project application. We also prefer larger aerial extents greater than 1,500 square miles. The reason for that is we see cost savings on LiDAR acquisitions for large areas as opposed to smaller project areas. And then we prefer projects where the applicant's cost share is higher and 50% or greater is best, but we don't preclude smaller projects and lower cost shares. It all just passes through our scoring system and then is determined by the evaluation committee. Next slide, please. So we're pleased to say that we're working at the moment on developing a new version of our hydrography program to align our hydrography, which is currently mapped as the NHD, vertically and horizontally with and temporally with 3DEP data. The idea here is to replace our existing older, pretty inconsistent nationally NHD and WBD with hydrography that is derived from 3DEP LiDAR so that we align two key components of the nation's topography. The idea being that if our data sets sort of fit together like Lego pieces and align, then we have a better modeling and analysis framework that models topography nationally for us. So we are in the process of developing the program for 3DHP. And so we do not yet have a funding mechanism for 3DHP data. And I know many of you are working on updates to your hydrography and are eagerly awaiting news of funding for 3DHP. We are working on it, and hopefully we plan to issue a 3DHP broad agency announcement similar to the 3DEP broad agency announcement as soon as we can. And as we align the two products together, we plan to align the two programs together as well and follow on the successes of the 3DEP program and follow some of the best practices and the governance and the processes that 3DEP has developed ahead of us. And that includes collaboration, again, with NSGIC through the NSGIC 3DHP for the Nation project. And I believe Phil may have already unveiled the information hub for 3DHP for the Nation. So hold on, we're coming. I know you guys are ahead of us on wanting to update your hydrography, and we're hoping to get moving on the USGS side as quickly as we can when it comes to funding. So that's all I have. Thank you.
It's great. Thanks. Thanks, everyone. And what I really would love to extend the learning here and get your experiences in the room and online. Are there opportunities that you've uncovered? Are there nuances? Are there things that we all want to do? How do we structure ourselves? Who do we partner with? How do we form those partnerships? Let's fire some of that off. Jamie, do you have anyone from our real friends who are virtual?
Nothing at the moment, Frank, other than a bunch of kudos about the presentations.
All right, great.
Jamie, I'll jump in if I'm audible.
Great. Yes, you're audible.
Yeah, this is Greg from Utah. I'm about picking up my kids, so I'm going to make it brief here. But I think what I just find really interesting about this is how, in the early days in Utah, we worked with the state to build local data sets, and that's how we got our funding. We got funding through the state legislature. We worked to build data sets, and then we were needed for basically making applications for state agencies, and we got funding that way. And then Matt and I recently have had conversations like, what's our role now? Where do we fit in? So this is really fascinating for me to see how, this almost seems like where we are now, is we are like in between, we're the middle person between the federal and and the locals, and this funding is really baked into these larger projects, such as broadband. So I don't know. It's just more or less a comment, but I think it's fascinating to see how funding has changed and how the use of it has changed here in Utah.
Yeah, I might spark up Bill a little bit because I am thinking about your comment related to Bill's topic. And do we have an opportunity to have a federated model going after federal funds?
Yeah, thanks, Greg. And I hadn't thought about it. I put these slides together for this presentation without connecting it to the previous one. But when you think about it, the way these federal programs are working is they're allocating the money to the states. They're federating that authority, that decision making to the states to then make awards at the state level. So it's very much a federated implementation. And so that gives you a lot of flexibility, Greg, and everybody else, to work with the policymakers in your state to try to direct things in a way that, builds resources that can be reused and applied to many applications. That's what we're all about, right? So here's another opportunity to do some of that.
So Neil McGaffey, Massachusetts. This is interesting because it kind of takes us back to where we started the week with our work in the GIO Academy about, among other things, how do you bring money together for, say, data development projects? So, if you want to build data, you need money, and either the money is in your shop or you work with a partner agency in state government where maybe they're the program, the health or whatever, and they apply through grants.gov, and then maybe you're guiding them on the GIS project, or maybe they've got GIS chops in-house and they do the whole thing themselves. But if you see any of these sources of money as a way of bringing major projects to your office, you need to really understand how to bring that money to the point where you can spend it. And so that's a whole bunch of administrative stuff, whether it's grants.gov or moving money between state agencies so you can do that or whatever.
Yeah, and Shelby was very clear about a threshold. If it's not $50,000, you don't want $49,000 worth of paperwork on a $50,000 grant, right? So certainly something to consider. And you sparked another idea, and that is the metaphor that I use, that sometimes like buying infrastructure or starting projects on a grant is a bit like buying a puppy. How do we structure these expenditures so that it leaves us in a sustainable space? So when the grant ends, we're in a better, more sustainable spot. And maybe that goes to the partnerships and the seed money. The work we did under the original broadband grant, the second phase of that, where we had an uptick in building a statewide address database, but then a plan to roll to a federated model without that, when that money ended, worked out pretty well. So that's a pretty good example. We got a little lucky. We hired temporary staff or permanent staff on temporary funding and through a reorganization wound up with them. So that was good. But nevertheless, just keeping an eye towards that. Something just kind of occurred to me. I was thinking through the framework data layers that was, they were in Bill's slide and kind of the threads that go through these opportunities. Certainly addresses show up in many of the use cases, from understanding and advancing our public health, understanding where people are getting sick and their addresses at which they live when they get vaccinated, those sort of things, to that's the same set of addresses that we could use to challenge the numerator on the formula for the broadband grant. The elevation data that we're talking about also has an implication in public health, believe it or not. And water flows downhill to the sewage treatment plant, and understanding, then tying back to the infrastructure for sewer and the public health implications of, here is my sewer shed, and if I pull this manhole, this is the catchment, and this is the community I can monitor for COVID or for opioids or for any number of other public health issues that are detectable with sewage. So there's a lot of synergies between and ways to support the things we already have as our core responsibility that we already are building partnerships around, that then we write a grant to build out a use case for that, or multiple use cases, So my head is kind of swimming with what do we do next? Oh yeah, AJ, go ahead.
Yep.
Thank you.
Hi, I just wanted to respond to the first question, because we see that evolution in healthcare industry as well, that at first the data sets were of interest. So you were paid to collate data sets and curate data, and then applications based on that data were of interest, and they were funding for that. And now what we're seeing, at least in healthcare, but leveraging technology and geospatial as well, is that there's a need for analysis of that data through those apps so that the information, the results, are sent to decision makers in a timely fashion, whether that decision maker is a clinician on the front line of care, or a decision maker at a WHO, World Health Organization, or hospital system level allocating resources. That evolution, I think, is important, and I think shows not just sustainability, but where we are in terms of using technology to address, in this case, a global public health challenge. I just wanted to make that comment and then pass the mic to Karen for her question.
That's great. Thank you. Yep.
Thank you, AJ. And thanks to Frank for moderating this. Agreed with Sheila. This is a great topic of conversation and a lot of good information. So my question is, not to sound like a broken record, but more of a complaint. In Wyoming, our governor's office and our broadband coordinator has passed off broadband mapping to WYGISC, which is not my complaint. WYGISC is the Wyoming Geographic Information Science Center at the University of Wyoming. And I work very closely with Teal over there, but she was telling me that they had, thrown out a bunch of solutions and proposals, and our governor's office said, well, we love it, but we're going to hold off on that. So they jerked the funding from them, pulled the rug out from under them, and said, we're going to hold off on ARPA money and instead wait for infrastructure bill money to pay for this effort. And so my question is more related to, how is this information communicated with states, with governor's offices, with their policy offices, so that they know, the changes that were, come out January 6th or whatever, that early January that Mike said, and how can I politely educate them and say, well, actually, you may want to reconsider this, or should I not?
So my knee jerk on that, and it's only uninformed because I'm suffering from the same being out of the loop. How is it? It's not coming to me, which is one of the reasons that we wanted to put this learning session together, so that you can come back after being with the NSGIC conference and say, see, we never can miss one of those. That's where we're learning about this stuff. That's a hell of a gap that's being left. We're doing our best to fill it in some way, but nature abhors that vacuum. I don't know, maybe there's other communication. Certainly, with something like with Sue's example, that was a part of a continuous outreach campaign that is just well communicated, and we understand that that's coming. With a lot of these other funding sources, I'm hearing about it in the news. Thanks, Karen. Mike, you had,
Karen, I was going to say we have found success with, if you use the current partners that you work with, right? Whether it's Esri or Tyler Technologies or some of the larger, call it primes that work with state and local governments, they'll help, I think, identify RFPs. And then if we have access to federal funding, this has been a success story where I've identified small business innovative research contracts or contracts within the Department of Energy and Department of Transportation. They always ask for letters of support or letters of intent. If I can get a state or a lab within a state like Oak Ridge or Sandia to basically glom on to the federal contract of how else they would use, whether it's mapping out all the nuclear facilities or mapping out the power grid or seeing how people move, right? If I get some type of state or local or one of the labs to write a letter of support, I can then use that for the state or for the lab who supports the state or for Esri who is supporting the state. So that is, again, that goes to the comment about doing some homework of what federal contracts are out there. And I'm in DC, the whole Beltway is just surrounded by people that are just combing through the SBIRS contracts, right? You can make a life out of that. But in reality, it's work with any partners you have right now because they probably have some bandwidth to at least look at some federal contracts. And then all it takes is a one-page letter of support, and most of the companies have that already drawn up. They're just say, hey, will you please sign this? It's a non-binding letter of support that you will use this data if it goes to an Esri or a Safegraph or a Tyler Technologies. So that I have found success with that with Department of Energy and Department of Transportation.
yeah, that's a good point, Mike. And something else that occurs to me is this isn't what comes easily and naturally to me. This isn't why I went to map school, right? That isn't why I wound up in this job. Yet what do? We knock down whatever hurdles in our way. And if funding's an issue, we knock it down, right? So that's because we want it. We want our programs to be successful. So I'm okay with that stretch. Bringing people along in that stretch. It's really got my wheels turning today. So.
Has NSGIC ever considered having a grants person on staff who does all that monitoring and tells all of us, here, go for this grant?
I'll defer to our interim executive director.
I don't know about past history, but I just wrote a new program director position description that has grant writing right in it. Both for NSGIC and on behalf of bringing that to all of you as members.
Yeah, what a service, what a need that fills. That's great. The whisper in the room was, you can pay me later on that, just, to bring everybody along. That's fantastic. Jamie, what else do we have in the chat? Or who wants to come on mute?
I don't see any questions, but Dan Haig put in a website for Esri. And Shelby added that a long time ago, it looked like maybe we did have a grants person at NSGIC, but it was ad hoc.
Yeah. Good, thank you. This is one of those things that it might not seem urgent. No one's sending me an email that I have to answer to, tomorrow. No one's knocking down the door. No one's asking for their password to be reset, right? But maybe it's super important. So what steps do we take? And actually putting a good step, this is a good example, putting this session on the agenda made it urgent, right? So what do we take those things that are important and do something to make them urgent? Let's set up some phone calls. Let's talk about some partnerships. Let's put those things on our calendars so that we force ourselves to dive into some of this, because I think it's going to float all boats.
Do we already have threads? Oh, sorry, Natalie from Georgia. Do we already have threads in my NSGIC on some of these particular grants so that we could partner up and have, like Mary and I were just talking about, like if there's a grant, maybe we could just get together and have a working session where we kind of plan our attack, so to speak. Do we already have that in NSGIC?
That's great, a great comment. And I think those threads are really topical threads, and the funding can be one piece of that. There's a pandemic task force thread. There's a 3D data thread. There's a, I don't know if there's a broadband thread, but anyways, so if we don't, let's identify those. I don't know that we have a federal funding thread, but I know we don't actually. So good idea.
Susan Miller, Georgia. What about a committee that would could just find the grants, not write the grants, but find them?
I'm writing that down. And that might be a good example of the, we can't do more with less. We can't have the same few people that are in our weekly meetings do more and more and more. But we have a whole coalition of the willing, probably. We have lots of partners and look at this panel. Contributors that are coming into this conversation for the first time that have an interest and potentially a financial interest in helping this be successful. So it's a good idea.
I might just add to that our private sector partners might be very interested in being on that committee as well, because if they find grants that we could apply for that could then utilize them, it's kind of a win.
I think you're going to win the election as the chair of that committee. So can I have a motion?
If I knew where to find the money, I'd probably have more than me in that.
Yeah. No, that's good. No, that's good. No, it's a great idea. It's something we can spin something up.
Frank, if I may.
Please.
Thank you. So some of you know that I have written a proposal and have kind of sparked the discussion in Wyoming to use infrastructure money to support funding derivative products from our LiDAR data and a portal for that data. And hearkening back to Dan's presentation this morning on 3-depth innovation, I mean, it seems like that would be pretty low-hanging fruit or something easy to rally behind for all, for USGS to work with states on that type of thing. Like if we can get USGS to say, hey, states, you should, let's work together to make this happen and define the requirements and, again, just work together to make that happen, not just, for Wyoming and the list of states that, I gathered the information for, but, let's make that a programmatic thing or a bigger effort.
I'm thinking of something that seems pretty repeatable there. And a lot of this isn't competitive. We're competing against other industries for some of this money, maybe, but it seems like there's plenty of money. It's not like you're competing against New York for the quality of your proposal in a lot of cases. So let's do that.
Mary from Pennsylvania. Going back to Susan's volunteering for her committee assignment. It's grant writing and like RFPs. You have to be so careful with your outside help that's coming in to make sure that that you keep that line, as they help you with the grant writing and then you get the grant and you hire them, somebody behind the scenes. So it's just putting that out there that you got to watch that fine line.
Right. Yeah, we certainly don't want to do anything that precludes a potential partner from eligibility. It's a good point. There's Snicker bars out in the hallway. I have one on my laptop if anybody needs it. It's all full of answers. It was tomorrow's lunch, but if you really have to have it. All right. Anything else from our virtual audience here? All right. Seems like we've got some work to do. Let's continue the conversation. I really appreciate everyone's hanging in there and the energy around this. Like I say, maybe not what we went to map school for, but certainly an opportunity. So appreciate all of our panelists here and all the contributions.
Thank you, everybody.
Thank you.